Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our new session with the GASI webinar series. The GASI webinar series serves as a platform for the GASI network members to share experience and expertise in evidence synthesis and to learn about potential collaborations. If you are joining us for the first time, please make sure to use these two options if you want to communicate with us. First, you have the questions tab on your right, where you can send us directly your question that we can address at the end of the session. Second, you can use the raise your hand button. And whenever we open the floor for comments, we can also unmute you so that you can give your comments straight to us. Today's session is on analyzing qualitative evidence synthesis data with Dr. Karen Daniels and Mr. Ari Odendal. Karen is a specialist scientist in the Health Systems Research Unit of the South African Medical Research Council. She is particularly keen on ensuring that health systems decision makers have appropriate research evidence at their disposal. She is well experienced. She has a well-experienced primary qualitative research and is increasingly involved in synthesis of qualitative studies. Ari is a senior scientist at the Health Systems Research Unit of the South African Medical Research Council. He has a keen interest in and sound experience in conducting qualitative research and is currently leading a qualitative evidence synthesis on health workers' perceptions and experiences of using mHealth technologies to deliver primary healthcare services. Thank you, Karen and Ari, for joining us today.
Thank you, Tamara. I'm bringing up my slides. Okay. Okay, right. So just checking everybody can see my screen. Tamara, can you see it?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I see that we have a lot of attendance. There's 25 people. Ari and I are in Cape Town. I see some of my colleagues from Cochrane, South Africa, and my another colleague, Natalie, is online, and lots of new people, Sarah Cooper. So lots of people to meet, and some people that we already know. So welcome today. As Tamara said, it's Ari and I today. Whoops. Okay, there we go. So the two people, so that you can see who we are, is myself on the left-hand side and Ari Odendal on the right-hand side. And we work together on a project whose name is quite long, the South African Initiative for Rapid Evidence Synthesis and Systematic Reviews in Health Policy and Systems Research, which is quite a mouthful. So situating today's presentation. Those of you who have been part of this process before will know, well, just first to start off with, is that we're doing a general introduction as part of a broader set of webinars, which is situated within our experience as health policy and systems researchers. Thus, today's presentation, as our previous presentation, is grounded in the principles of health policy and systems research, which really means that it's multidisciplinary, but it's also very much stakeholder engaged. So we're looking for methods that we can use that are particularly relevant for stakeholders and that make evidence meaningful for stakeholders. And it's also, just as you know, because you've signed up, but the focus is on qualitative evidence synthesis across the series of webinars. So for those who are new, just a quick reminder, typically qualitative evidence synthesis is more interpretive than aggregative. Qualitative evidence synthesis attempts to answer what is the meaning of the process or the phenomena for the people involved, and how is the process or the phenomena being experienced. It allows for multiple perspectives to be heard, and it also offers rich contextual information about the setting in which intervention was implemented. Okay, so it's also overall systematic reviews have been conceptualized as either aggregative, that is that they're adding things together. So you're taking knowledge from one primary study, adding it to knowledge of another primary study. So typically your forest plot would look at that because you look at the size. You're adding and you're saying, what is the size of the diamond? What is the size of the effect? Whereas qualitative evidence synthesis tend to fall within the configurative or the interpretive spectrum. That is that you have one picture or you have one part of the puzzle and you put it together and you create a new picture from the thing that you've seen. Okay, so I won't go into that too much. We did cover it in our last presentation, as well as in the first presentation from Jane Noyes, which participants are welcome to go back to, and they're all on the GESI website. But that's just to situate and remind us again what we're thinking about. So where are we in this series? So firstly, what has been covered already is that we had an introduction to qualitative evidence synthesis from Jane Noyes. Natalie Leon, who is also online, together with myself, the two of us did the previous session on question formulation. Today, we're going to look at analysis within qualitative evidence synthesis. And then in September, my colleague Ari Oden, who is with me, will talk about drafting findings, not September, is it in early September? And then later on, I can't remember what date, in October, another colleague of ours, Simon Lewin, will talk about circle. So, all right. So, just thinking about qualitative evidence synthesis again, to situate where analysis fits within this. Okay, so if one looks at the steps of qualitative evidence synthesis, so for those who are even newer, qualitative evidence synthesis essentially is the synthesis of findings from primary studies, from primary qualitative studies, as compared to traditional systematic reviews, which synthesizes evidence from quantitative studies. Okay, so a lot of the principles or the processes are very similar, but of course, differences particularly in what kind of data you're looking at and how you analyze it. Okay, so the first step in a qualitative evidence synthesis, as with any other kind of review, is that one either solicits or receives or decides on the qualitative evidence synthesis question. Okay, so in our case, we have stakeholders, and they might request that we do a particular review. Sometimes we will also ask people, so we might priority setting exercise and ask people, what do you want to know? At other times, we may ourselves just amongst the group, within the unit, etc., decide that we feel that this is a priority. So those are the ways that you get to your question. Then the next step would be the clarifying of the question, which I won't go into now because, as I said, Natalie touched on that. I looked at that quite a lot in the last round. After that, we develop the protocol. And when we develop the protocol, we decide first on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. We develop a search strategy. And this is the first point at which you start to think about the analysis, because you just start to think upfront, what approach do I want to use? And I will talk later on about three different approaches. They're not the only approaches, but they're three approaches that link to each other and from each other, and that we've been using. So you decide up front, based on this data, based on this question, how do I, because you won't have the data yet, but how do I want to approach this? Then you go on and once your protocol is done, you go on, you search and you screen the literature and you select the studies for inclusion. And of course, there's an assessment of the quality of the primary studies. And then comes the data analysis. And just to say that we haven't thought about it, we haven't done anything on the assessment of quality, but we can tomorrow consider another webinar at a certain point, because we have done a lot of work around assessing quality. But when you come to the data analysis, which is a point at which you've already done this assessment, you've decided what's in, what's out, this is the point at which you start first with immersion in the primary studies. That means that you read all of the studies. So we, for example, in our current reviews, had 23 studies, and we read each and every one over and over, and multiple people within our project read it. And we'll talk about that also later on as we proceed. Then one codes the data. Now, this is the content of the primary studies, and this is pretty much those people who are familiar with primary qualitative research. It's the same process, because you treat your paper, your primary study, as a transcript. So previously in a primary research, you will treat your interview, your recorded interview, as a transcript. This time around, you're treating your whole study as the transcript. After there's been a coding, you then extract the data and you organize it. So extracting means that you're going to lift certain passages from that primary study and organize that then into further categories. And that is the key of the data analysis process. That's the heart of what you're doing. But as I will talk through, you'll hear that there's a lot to this heart. Okay. Then you start to interpret the categorized data through the process of writing up the findings. So as you write up, so you look at the data again and you find new meaning. You say, is the thing that we categorized this, is it what we thought it was? Do we recategorize it, etc.? Then, in our case, this may include a circle process. As I said, that is coming in October, and there is literature for anybody who is interested in learning about circle. But this is looking at the certainty that one can place in the findings. And finally, you complete your final report, which may involve further interpretation. For example, during the discussion, you may look at the data again, you may look at your findings, and then you might come up with another insight. And all of this interpretation then forms part of your full analysis process, okay, which is very different to a quantitative, because in quantitative, you're just extracting the numbers, you're running statistical not programs, tests, yeah, statistical tests on the data. And here, on the other hand, we're reading it. And again, all of, qualitative evidence synthesis for me is just like, it's just like primary qualitative research, but on a grand scale. So everything that you do in a primary study, such as that you're reading, you're involving yourself as a person, you do it again. And the analysis process is very much so. The researcher is very hands-on. They're constantly reading, constantly making sense of the set of data. So what is analyzed in qualitative evidence synthesis? So in primary studies, those who are familiar with qualitative research, you analyze your interview data. If you've done interviews, you analyze observation data. If you, for example, sat in a clinic, or you sat in whatever kind of setting, a school, wherever it might be, you've taken notes. Perhaps you have field notes. You analyzed your perceptions, how you reacted to certain things, etc. Anything in that, that through which you get the data in the primary studies, all of that becomes analyzed. In qualitative evidence synthesis, we analyze the primary study. So we never work with the original raw data. We never see the original interview transcript. We don't see the original observation data. All we get is what we got from the primary study. So this means that we can include the entire manuscript text. So we could analyze everything from start to finish. We could, depending on the approach we've decided on for our review, we could only analyze the findings or discussion, because we might say that that is where the authors put the data, depending on what we regarding as data. We could only analyze the quotes. That means that we only the primary study participant voice, or we could analyze the quotes and the author's interpretation. So that's the participant voice and the author explanations. Now, when this becomes important is because some studies might only want to listen to what the primary participant said. Some other studies, for example, might want to actually analyze how the authors argued what they did. And that's when you analyze the entire manuscript. That's when you're looking at what is the author, so for example, narrative synthesis. In that, people might actually be looking at what is the argument, what's the line of argument here by the author. And that's the data, not just what the participants said. Okay, and these are decisions that you would need to, with your team, take up front. Okay, so I've explained some of that. We may be seeking to analyze participant voice, we may be seeking to analyze author's voice, or we may be seeking to analyze both. So then, I did say up front and in the emails which you would have received that we would look at 3 approaches, and I will just, because we've sent you the literature, I will just touch on these 3 approaches. So the first approach is thematic synthesis, and the articles for that are from Thomas and Harden, James Thomas and Angela Harden, and there's also a textbook by David Goff, Sandy Oliver, and James Thomas. I've read the 2012 version, but there is also a 2017 version. And these are 2 good sources for learning about thematic synthesis. There is framework synthesis, and again, the Goch, Oliver, and Thomas textbook covers that, so it is quite useful in that respect. And it's also covered in the Mary Dixon Woods article. And those of you who didn't, everybody who registered would have gotten the links, but otherwise it is within, anybody who's watching this afterwards can simply follow these references. Then finally, I will have a quick look at the best fit framework synthesis, and Christopher Carroll and Andrew Booth particularly are the people who have been writing about this approach. Okay, so thematic synthesis. Thematic synthesis uses an inductive approach, okay? So it involves analyzing data from primary studies in an inductive manner, which is also the approach which is commonly used in primary studies. Using this approach, reviewers code the primary studies, or sometimes just the results section, often the discussion and the conclusions too, line by line, as if coding a transcript of an interview or field notes from a qualitative observation. This coding can then lead to the development of descriptive themes. These are the analysis at a manifest or superficial level, so you're not really going very deep, or analytical themes when the reviewers go deeper and they try to find patterns or relations and explanations in the data, thus analyzing at the latent level. So that again is very similar to what one does in a primary study. The approach is appropriate when the reviewers are doing an exploratory study, want to see what emerges from the data, and when they hold no prior assumptions about what they might find in relation to the review question. Okay, so you really don't know what you're going to find. You just have an open mind, you go into it, you just see everything that emerges, similarly to what one might do, as I said, in a primary study. It can produce very rich data. Yeah, it can. So the approach is appropriate when the reviewers are doing an exploratory study, wanting to see what emerges from the data, and when they hold no prior assumptions. Sorry, I said that. And although, so it can lead to very rich, very nuanced data, which is positive. However, the slightly negative part of this approach is that it takes long. Okay, because you don't have anything, you have to read everything, everything is emerging, you have no prior code. All you have is your question that is defining this. The negative for us who are doing health policy and systems research is that we often have stakeholders who want something quickly. So we don't have, so Ari and Ari will talk about our review, but last year when we did this, we took a couple of months to read and analyze the 23 interviews. It was quite intense. We sat in the same room, etc. But sometimes that might be too long for your stakeholders, and then you want to think about another approach. Also, another downside of this is that because it's an intuitive process, it can be a challenge to communicate transparently, because a lot of what one is doing, you apply a code, or you apply a theme, or you apply a category, but it's sometimes difficult to describe how you came to that. And that is the same challenge that one has in qualitative research, no matter how transparent one tries to be. Okay? So framework synthesis, in contrast, then, is a deductive analysis. So inductive means that something comes out of the data. Deductive means that you bring something to the data. Okay, so it's an a priori. You bring your labels in advance, is a deductive analysis. In framework analysis, what the reviewers will do is that they develop a tentative framework of themes or concepts in advance. This tentative framework is based on either the reviewer's own understanding, or it could be based on the literature, or it could be created in conjunction between the requesters of the review and the reviewers. So if, for example, your stakeholder is a policy maker in your national government, and they say, I want a review on how people perceive, let's say, antiretroviral service in primary healthcare clinics. And then they have certain very specific things. They want to know things like, do the people perceive that there's stigma involved? Do they perceive that this is of high quality, etc., etc.? So all of those things you can then decide up front you want to add. And when you look at the data, you're very specifically looking for the things that you've all the categories that you've decided and that you've populated your framework with up front. Okay, so as I said, it's useful when your requester has a predefined question and issues. The framework can then be used to actively address those questions. It's very transparent because your requester can see that these are the things that you decided to look for, and this is what you found. Okay, so it's not intuitive in the same way that thematic analysis is, because it's all predefined. You're not looking at what emerged. It can be used to combine data from different sources into the same group. So, for example, in a mixed methods review. So what is useful about this is that in a mixed methods review, you might say you want data on, I'm trying to think what one might find, but not necessarily on experience. So you want data on nutrition, school children and nutrition. So if you have quantitative data about the nutrition and you have qualitative data about the nutrition, whatever it is, whatever your category might be, you can group them together and you can compare them. So it's just like creating baskets. You're not necessarily going into it deeper, but you're categorizing things from different sources and you're looking at them then together. The disadvantage is that this framework can be too restrictive, because if you decide a priori on this framework and you then find data from something else, it might be you find data that shows something that's outside of your framework, then it would be hard to categorize that data. You'll find yourself struggling. What do I do with this, because it doesn't fit the thing that I have, but I know it's important. Okay. So then along comes the best fit framework, which responds to the challenge of the framework analysis. So best fit framework combines both thematic and framework analysis. It systematically explores the literature. So this is how it starts. You systematically explore the literature for a framework that will best align with a research question. Okay, so you look for frameworks, see if there's any framework. So we're currently doing a review on integration, primary healthcare integration, and we will be looking for frameworks that speak to integration or frameworks that speak to health worker experience in an attempt to use those and ones that best fit our question. But simultaneously to searching the literature for framework, you also are searching for primary studies that meet your inclusion criteria. So effectively, you've got two pots, because you've got your one pot, your literature on the frameworks, and in your other pot, all of the primary studies that meet your question. Then the reviewers develop a tentative framework based on the best fit from the literature. So they look for a framework that fits best, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be more or less okay. Then simultaneously, the reviewers are coding the primary studies as one would do in the thematic analysis. They fit the data from the primary studies into the best fit framework. So you're looking for those codes that are already there in that framework, but you also are looking for new themes. So remember I said with a framework, what do you do with the ones that don't fit in? This time round, you're purposefully looking for other things. There's, the one framework which is the best fit, plus everything that is new. The reviewers then compare the new themes and categories, and you translate that into the predefined best fit framework. So that means that you're looking at whatever emerges and you're saying, how is this related to the best fit framework that we designed? Is there any connection? Can we add it? How does the one speak to each other? Okay. And out of that comparison, the reviewers then develop a new higher level framework that brings together both the predefined theory that came out of the literature and the framework together the new themes and categories that emerge. So you actually get a second higher level framework, which then becomes a finding in itself. Okay. And and that then is the biggest offering from that review. It does, however, to do this approach does, however, require that there is the existence of some predefined theories and frameworks. If they aren't, then it would make it quite difficult. Then you would have to then just go back to doing a thematic analysis, because there isn't some questions lend themselves to this. For example, if you were doing something on smoking, there might be change theories around smoking behavior. If there's ideation theory, etc., etc. If you were looking like at suicide ideation, there might be theories on that. But if you're working in an area for which people haven't developed frameworks, then it still requires using a more inductive approach. All right, so those are the three. And as I said, we've sent some of the literature if you want to have a look at it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about ourselves. This is the exciting part. And we're glad that the microphones are off, so if you laugh at our process, then we can't hear you. Okay, so Ari, I, and Natalie, who's also online, along with other colleagues, have been working on a review called on an mHealth review. mHealth is mobile health, which essentially is the use of things such as mobile phones, smartphones, etc. In healthcare. And we were interested in health workers' perceptions of mHealth within primary healthcare. Okay, and that was our question. And also just remember, always the analysis is driven by answering the question. So our story is that for us, the data coding, extraction, and synthesis process was iterative and aligned with the thematic synthesis process outlined by Thomas and Harden. As a first step, what we did was that the study characteristics of all the included studies was extracted by two people. That was Ari and one other person into an Excel spreadsheet, which Ari will show you. These characteristics included the study aims, types of primary health care, type of health worker, etc. Also some things about the methods, okay? Thereafter, the studies, we read each study as a whole, including the background, methods, results, discussion, and conclusions to get a sense of meaning and their contribution to answering the review question. During that initial stage, Ari, plus our colleague Jocelyn and Natalie, who was also online, shared with their team their ideas of what they thought would be the preliminary codes. Then Ari and I and a fourth colleague, Jane, it's quite a big review because there were two more people that we don't even mention, but we then met in person and we discussed both our own insights on the reading of the full text as well as the preliminary codes which Ari, Natalie, and Jocelyn had created. This discussion led us to abandoning what we proposed in the protocol. That was to deductively apply predefined theoretical frameworks to code the data, as these frameworks did not align well with what we began inductively see as emerging from the data. So instead, we then developed a broad set of data extraction categories that were further validated through email discussion with the rest of the review authors. However, once Ari and I eventually sat down and came together to do the final line by line, it was clear that the best approach would be to inductively code the data across the full text of each study using the codes that emerged from the text as each full text was read aloud. So I mean, imagine Ari and I were sitting in a not a locked room, but we were sitting in a room reading this aloud to each other, and as the stuff emerged, we then you came up with these codes, okay? As one full text was coded, these codes were recorded for use across all of the studies, thus beginning the process of what Thomas and Harden call translating the data from the study into other studies. So if I see this code here, I can, in study 1, I apply it to study 2. And sometimes a new code will come up in study 2 and I backtrack it and apply it to study 1, etc., as you go down the line. So new codes that emerged from subsequent studies were also recorded, and the already coded studies were returned to, so to determine if these codes applied to that data too. The coded extracts were then copied into a Word document where they were organized into broad themes, thus continuing the process of data translation. Coded data that did not neatly fit into these themes were also copied into the extraction document and marked for further consideration. So using the thematically coded data, Ari and I then wrote up discrete findings based on the data extracts. Since many of the extracts did not neatly fit within any theme, we continued this iterative process of trying to make sense of the extracts by regrouping them with other extracts from which similar underlying issues emerged, and eventually we synthesized all the extracted data into findings. We also constantly evaluated each extract against our inclusion criteria and review objectives, deciding up until the very end whether or not it was an appropriate fit. So the findings thus represent the final translation of the coded data across all the included studies. Okay, so if there's anything, that's quite a long story, but if there's anything to get from that is that it's an iterative process and it's a pretty messy process, and you think you're going to do it one way and then you do another way, and the only way to really do it is just to jump right in. You can't do, you have to read the data a lot, and code it and think and rethink and constantly think. And this constant thinking is not the same as second guessing. It really is just deciding, is this the best that we can say about this data? Okay. So now I'm going to hand over to Ari, who's going to show you in some detail how we got to all of that.
Hi everybody. So we started off by extracting the study details as shown in this Excel file. The study ID, country, whether it was a rural or peri-urban, urban setting, across a number of issues, and you will clearly recognize the PICO in all of the data that that we extracted here. We also had in column N whether it's a lone standing or a study that's embedded within another study, because we know that many of those ML studies are pilot studies, and we are interested in recording whether this is indeed a pilot study or embedded in another study. So after that, we then completed a included studies map, which is a very useful overview of all the included studies that we do have at hand to analyze. Here is an example of one of the variables on which we drafted the map, the country in which the study was done. And then you see below the box there, the table there, are the other variables on which we extracted data for and mapped it on that Excel file of ours. Thanks, Karen. And this is going to come in very handy because we are at the stage in our review that we got the second set of records from the librarian that's doing the search for this review, and it will help us to identify any obvious gaps in those variables. So we are concerned at this point that we only got studies. We didn't find any studies from Latin America. So in our new round of included studies, we will definitely look for those missing studies that we identified in the map here. So the mapping has two reasons why we think it's important. The one is that it's the start of data immersion, and then the second reason is that at some point in your reporting on the review or in the manuscript that you will submit, you will have a section in which you complete the study details. So you might as well do this as at the beginning of your data extraction coding. Karen referred to sitting down together, and this is what physically happened. She had here's an example. Cancel. An example of how the process of coding and categorizing happened. Karen did the coding on this paper from Mitchell, and you will see, and I'm sure for those of you that are familiar with qualitative data, this is not a strange thing to see. Highlighting issues, writing in the column on matters that comes to mind as she is reading the transcript, the data as presented in the study. And here she said, I'm inclined to leave this out. And then she had in this quote, she said, made them feel very more confident. So that's what happened here in terms of marking and starting the process of coding the data. So we did this for one study together we did this for one study, and I want to show you how the coding of that study that was then copied and pasted into a Word document. This is an example from Barnaby, and similarly to the paper I just showed you, we just copied and pasted the text and started to think about what is the meaning of this in relation to our review question, and add a label to categorize the data that we extracted. Here you can see we had 3 labels, 3 codes: new tasks because of mHealth, and there's the supporting data, midwives also indicated. The second code was connectedness, directness, immediacy, and note at this point that label is not very detailed and specific. It was our thinking at that point. And then the third example is patient use of services. And as Karen said previously, so then we took this Barnaby code list and started to work through our next included study. And we started to use Barnaby's codes to code the existing or the new data that we got from the second study. And we also then refer back to Barnaby if there were issues that were raised in the second study that made us think that we are missing some of the codes in Barnaby. So if you can recall, we had this very first code of new tasks because of mHealth, that comes from Barnaby. But then we read Praveen, and this extract made us realize, but hang on, it seems to me that new tasks because of mHealth does have more nuances as what we saw in Barnaby. And we labeled Barnaby's quote, the one midwives, as to a sub code task at the same level of job description. But the one that we got from Praveen said, well, it's task shifting, but it's subcoding. We subcoded it as it's straightforward task shifting. But there was also an example in further down in the Praveen paper that, well, there's an issue if there's task shifting, but there's not clinical expertise from the mHealth user to manage and to use this task shifting appropriately. And another example is the one that we got from How, that made us elaborate and reorganize our initial theme on connectedness, directness from Barnaby. And in this way, there's nothing mysterious about it. It's very hard work. We ended up coding all 23 studies, and in the end, we completed, or we ended up with a master file code list. There you see the product. So there's a theme, service delivery, another theme on challenges, and there's also a theme on technical issues and so forth. And under each of those themes, we have the codes and also subcoding of the data. And then for each of those B1 code, there will be supporting data. And that's the important thing for us in this qualitative evidence synthesis, is to be able to substantiate our claim on our findings by backing it with the supporting data that we got from the coding. Karen, anything from your side to add that I missed here?
No, I mean, I think Ari's really, yeah, I do want to leave time for questions. I see we have 15 more minutes. but it really is an iterative process of back and forth and back and forth. And it's hard work, but it's also fun. It's also interesting to work with the data in this way. So I'll just close off before we open the lines for questions and talk about some of the lessons and recommendations for others. Is that we feel that if you're going to do qualitative, this analysis of, well, as with any kind of qualitative analysis, you need dedicated blocks of time. You can't work on it for an hour today and then come back and work for it 3 hours next week. What Ari and I did was we just blocked off like a week, 2 weeks, and just worked through it. Yeah, and full days. So, you know, and we organized the time because obviously we have other things to do. So we tended to work from 10 o'clock until 4 o'clock, until 10 o'clock till 4:30, and just keep that flow going every day. It does require at least 2 people to work physically together. That is what we found. We didn't think it would have worked if we were apart. So we sat together, reading, coding, organizing, interpreting, reorganizing. We feel, even though we had a big group, that very intensive last period of the coding, you shouldn't have too many people because otherwise it becomes unwieldy. So when we had others in the beginning, it got like, you know, everybody had a different interpretation. And in the end, you just really need somebody to make the call. So it's good to get the feedback, but also with limitations. One should anticipate that it's an iterative and messy process. Anticipate that primary studies are variable in the data that they yield. So some will have rich data and others will have one line. Sometimes the one line is good, sometimes the rich data gives you nothing. We worked with a data projector. So we sat in the room, use a data projector. I called it overhead projector. Ari told me it's like, you know, that's behind the times. We must call it a data projector. But anyway, we projected every primary study onto the wall and we read it like that. We coded from that also, so it's up, it's big, organized, and co-wrote, all using this, you know. And that you should also use your broader team as a sounding board, especially to check your interpretations, because you can. So on the one hand, we're saying don't use too many people in the finer part, but on the other hand, take your stuff in the beginning, take it back, and at the end, take it back to your co-authors. All right, and that is the last of our lessons. The next webinar is how we would have moved from that categorized data to findings. So the next webinar will come after this one. Okay, I think I'll just go back. I'll just go back to the opening one, and then tomorrow you can open the slides. Not open the slides, you can open for questions.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Ari. This was a really interesting presentation, and thank you for sharing about your own experience and the lessons learned. I'm sure it's been it's added a lot to all of us. So the first question we have is from Andrew, and it's so let me share this with everyone. So can you? Sorry, this. Yes. So. Can you not just create a framework from your own literature review as opposed to an existing model or theory?
Well, we had a look at the frameworks for ML, and I'm a bit too stupid to have made sense of those frameworks. It was difficult. So yeah, I think it is indeed that you can use existing models, but I struggled.
So, no, but what Andrew, you're asking, I'm just reading, can you not just create a framework from your own literature review as opposed to an existing model or theory? So the answer is that in the best fit framework, they do that. But what the authors are saying, so we looked at which Andrew this was, because we were a bit worried that the question was coming from Andrew Booth.
No,
so, okay, now that we know it wasn't Andrew Booth. So the answer is that the whole point of doing framework analysis, both best fit framework and framework analysis, is that you're enhancing the speed. So you look for what exists out there before you necessarily start something new. And the same thing really applies for any kind of synthesis, that we're trying not to create again. We're trying to look at what exists before we start a new one. So there's no reason not to create a new one. Yeah, but you also try, and the one doesn't exclude the other. Thanks, Andrew. I hope that answers the question.
So actually we can, so Andrew, if you'd like to add anything, maybe we should unmute. So you can go ahead and make any additional comment. Okay, so
no more questions. I'm going to throw it back to my colleagues so I can see there. Darshini and Charles Waisongi and Eleanor. No questions for Ari and I. We're waiting for the questions.
Well, it looks like you've explained everything very clearly and very well. So maybe I could ask, how long do you usually allocate for conducting your data analyses? I know it will depend on many factors, but what's the longest period you've put in to conduct the data analysis so far?
Well, so I mean, for us, it took us, but we did have blocks of, so we had blocks and we had breaks. But I think that it should be, I mean, at least a month and a half. If you're not breaking it up, then I think a month and a half. So for us, it was slightly longer because we were breaking it up with, we had big blocks, but then we had to do some other things because one has a. But you should, I mean, and it can take, I mean, a month and a half, 2 months, because it's 23 studies is a qualitative, it's a big amount of data to work through. But when I'm saying that also, I'm talking about the writing up part of it also. So we were under a little bit of pressure because our work had to go into a guideline and we needed to have the answers like by October, right? And we started working intensely because you took the things to Norway in October. So we started working intensely in August. So last year it was intensely August this time, and then some of the time in September, but then also part of that time was writing it up. And so we were ready with our preliminary analysis by early October. Yeah.
So we have Sarah Cooper actually who would like to make a comment. So Sarah, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sarah.
Okay, my question is around what you think of the possibility of using a program like NVivo or other kind of qualitative data analysis program, what you think about using that for a systematic review analysis process.
So, Sarah, I think that's a webinar that you can present. No, the answer is that I don't have any hard and fast feelings about it. I am not familiar enough with those programs for us to have used it. I think anything that you do shouldn't be a test on yourself. So I think if you are familiar with using NVivo for primary studies, then you should go ahead and use it for your quantitative studies as well. But I don't think that you should. I don't think you should learn to use NVivo just to do a qualitative evidence synthesis. I think it can. Don't delete it, buddy. I think it can assist you if you haven't. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So don't go and learn a new program just to do this. Use what you were doing before. I think it does make it more efficient, but it'll be efficient if you know the program. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karen.
Okay, so I'm going to read through. We're seeing some more questions. Tomorrow, shall I just read them?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so we've got one from Tony Williams. Is the benefit framework synthesis when you are creating the initial framework? At what point do you bring in the literature? So my understanding of the best fit framework is that that you do it in parallel. In an ordinary systematic review, you would be reading on the one hand, you would just be reading all your primary studies. But when you do the best fit framework, you're actually doing two searches and two processes almost of inclusion and exclusion. Because on the one hand, you're doing, so do go and look at the literature, because they do show it in the articles that I sent. They do show these two parallel processes where you search for the primary studies and you search for literature at the same time, and then from that you find it. In the framework analysis, they tend to have the framework in advance, so they're not searching for literature on the framework. And then you bring it in at the point when you have all your included studies. So you then you look at your frameworks, you decide, okay, this is the framework that works for us based on the literature. Now you have your primary studies and you've analyzed it, and you compare new quotes plus your framework that you have already started applying to these and see if that makes sense. Okay. So Andrew Edwards Jones has got another question, and he asks, picking up on the speed issue, the best fit paper suggests this method is best for quick reviews. Does that suggest it is less suitable for longer reviews? No, I don't think it's, I mean, I don't know. I think that people, you know, like Andrew Booth can be asked. I wouldn't say it's not suitable, but I think what they're trying to say is that we work in a context where people want something quickly, and this might help you. So you can take a longer approach to it. But if you have a policymaker who wants something in quite a quick turnaround, this might help you, because I mean, Ari and I did find that doing that thematic analysis, you know, it took a while because we were trying to make sense of it all of the time. But of course, all of these framework analysis, they do, you know, they do have their limitations. So it's really, but I don't think one is better than the other. It just depends on what your need is. Ostrida Gondwe, we'll just say thank you to you. And then Andrew, something just said allows, was the only question. And then the next is from Natalie, but we can't see what I'm just going to open, I think, all right. No, I can't see.
So it says hi, Karen.
Oh, you just, hello, Natalie. I thought there was more to it. Okay, then we had Sarah's, and then we've got another one from Tony Williams. For example, the existing frameworks provide the first a priori, and then you code the primary studies, or do you look at the primary studies for codes that do not fit into the a priori before you start the coding? So I just wasn't sure at what point the primary studies inform the framework. Yeah. So I think, Tony, the answer is that it is iterative, and we're going to start one. I haven't used Best Fit myself, but we're going to start one now. But it's meant to be that it's both, that you have the framework that you got from the data and you apply it to the primary studies, but then you look at what else is there, and then you take what you find in the primary studies that didn't fit, and then you get the stuff that didn't fit to talk with the framework. I know sometimes it seems a bit esoteric, but that is the translation process, is that you say, okay, we've categorized, you know, all of these things related to people's perceptions of MHAF. And the framework says that people will take on technology in this particular way. Is there anything that matters with it? But you also at the same time are taking what you find in the literature. So for example, if you had some kind of change theory in the literature, you're also looking for those codes related to the change theory, which would be your framework, and you're also looking for that in the data. So you're looking for multiple things simultaneously. Okay, and then my colleague Dosh, who is just 2 rooms, she could actually, I'm sure if I shout, she can hear me. So Dosh is asking, did you extract data and paste this into Excel. And did you, so we know, I mean, Dash, we didn't use in Vivo. We didn't paste our data into Excel, we pasted it into Word. But in Excel, we just extract the study characteristics. And then Natalie says, yeah, we remind people on the need to limit the included studies because it's labor intensive and because of data saturation and need for sampling, which may require another webinar. That is very true. So what the thing is, because you have, you know, in quantitative research, you're often looking for stuff and you find like 1 or 2 studies. If you do qualitative evidence synthesis, it's like the entire opposite. You just get flooded with so many. There is within, and I think we can also send our protocol, because we do talk about how we would have sampled if we gotten beyond a certain point. But I think I agree with Natalie that the whole sampling process is another webinar to explain. Right. Gladys. Okay. How do you factor in contextual? So we did a lot with our contextual data comes, and Ari and Simon will talk about that. But we really used it at the point of our circle, where we looked at where material came from, whether, and we would also often, we would categorize something such, if it really is general. So we would say things like health workers like, you know, like playing with new technology, for example, say that's a code. But if it's very specific, so in the context of a lack of other telephones, health workers appreciated mobile phones. So that shows you it's not going to be in a context such as in Scandinavia, where people have lots of access. So we're very specific as to which context the data actually came from, if it only applies to a certain context. If it applies to everybody, then we will write it up as applying to everybody, but you have to look quite closely. And then Andrew Edwards just volunteered to do, along with Sarah Cooper, another webinar for us. Thanks, Andrew Edwards. I know that isn't exactly what he said, but he says he teaches it and it suits his methods perfectly. So I'm taking that as a volunteering, as you volunteering. And then we've got a quick, so Josh is happy. Yiti, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You asked, in addition, using soft to facilitate the review process, our team has been using Joanna Briggs Institute's summary for our reviews. It facilitates using out findings, categorizing them, and synthesizing all findings. Thanks, Yiti. So again, I'm passing that up to tomorrow. Looks like there's definitely a need for a webinar on that. And then Sheila has told us something about her piano keys. So thanks, Sheila. And then Eleanor, who is our colleague also from Cochrane, says that they're using framework synthesis. We're extracting the data as per the themes presented by the authors. The challenge is that we are finding additional themes within the themes presented by the authors. How do we synthesize such data? So that, Eleanor, is where I think the best fit framework is good to read, because that's exactly what they say, is that you have this framework. That's what Christopher Carroll and Andrew Booth are saying. That you have this framework, but then you have the other stuff. And they therefore develop best fit as a way to marry both the thematic analysis, which is just everything that comes up, along with a framework analysis. All right, here we got another offer. Oh, but that's you also, Andrew. And he's saying he teaches. Oh no, it's the same. It's the same comment. So I think we've covered all the comments, and we are at 4 minutes past 4.
Amazing time management.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much, Ari.
It's a pleasure.
The recording for this session will be posted on the GASI website within 1 week from today. And we look forward to having you with us on the next session in September. You can also find the link for registration for the next session on the GASI website.
Okay, and we thank everybody. Sorry.
Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for
Thanks.
joining.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Oh, Ari. I think that was okay. Should we just close?